Die Geldmeisterin. Der Finanzpodcast mit Julia Kistner.
Hello, Guy Stear, Head of Developed Market Strategy, Amundi Investment Institute. Thank you for taking the time to explain us a little bit about the earnings seasons and the earnings of the companies, how they could be so well, even if the situation around is not that easy.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me, Julie. It's a great honor to have the chance to speak with you.
Fine. So, according to your forecast, how long could the uncertainty which we have right now, the situation in the Middle East, the energy prices, remain highly fluid? Do you have any forecast, or do you say you can forecast that?
No, we certainly have forecasts, Julia. The question is, I think even the answer to your question is we have to be somewhat careful about it, because the first thing I would say is we are quite optimistic that we will see a reopening in the Straits of Hormuz, and we will see rerouting in oil from the Middle East. And we will see some replacement of Middle East oil with oil from other areas of the world. And we will see some change in the type of energy that countries and companies use. So, I mean, people use electricity in their production processes, but there will be changes in the way they produce that electricity. So, having said all that, we can come up with a forecast for how we think oil will evolve. And as I said, we're fairly optimistic. So we expect that with a partial reopening of the Straits of Hormuz, very partial probably in the summer, but beginning in the summer and entering into the third quarter, we could end up with a drop in oil prices to around $90 a barrel, and an average of oil prices around $90 a barrel over the fourth quarter. So that's very much the scenario that we're looking for in terms of oil prices. But I think $90 a barrel is not where we were at the beginning of the year. We were at 60, obviously. So it's less of a change relative to the average over 2025, because you'll remember that oil prices generally fell over 2025. But nonetheless, it's difficult to see a world in which we go back to $60 a barrel over the course of this year at least.
So even if we go down to $60, the higher energy prices already began to impact the manufacturing sectors. Do they? Or
Well, I think that's true. I mean, again, our scenario is not that oil prices would drop to $60 a barrel. We think they will retrace to around $90 a barrel. I think the reality is that in many sectors are still living a little bit on inventories that they stocked up at the beginning of last year. It's at this point where accounting details really matter. So, for example, if you have a company which is using last in, first out accounting, then the increase in energy prices will be very quick. But if you have a company which is using first in, first out, then you will obviously, depending on the amount of inventories that they're holding, you will see the price rise through rather more slowly. So it's probable. We only have the Q1 numbers, of course. The crisis started at the last month of Q1, and then we had prices rising at the end of Q1 and through Q2. It's probable that we will see the influence of higher energy prices on company results in Q2 in particular.
and which industries and regions are particularly affected by this?
Well, the number one industry that is affected by this is transportation. So whether it's land transportation, so trucking or things like that, whether it's air transportation, this is when you look at each sector and you say which sectors use the most energy as a part of their operating costs. Transport is by far and away the highest. The second most affected sector are probably sectors that rely a lot on the derivatives of oil, so things like fertilizer production, chemical companies in particular. And then the third most affected sectors are sectors where they are using a lot of energy in their industrial processes. So those are lots of industrial companies where energy as a part of their process can be anywhere between 5 and 10%.
But we just saw some earnings of the chemical and fertilizer sector, which wasn't that bad as everybody
Right.
thought. Is this because of the shortage of the products also helps them to get bigger modes?
Well, yes and no. I mean, I think we have to be somewhat careful with one effect, which is that if the product you make uses a lot of oil derivatives, so for example, uses a lot of nitrogen, and it's going to get much more expensive to produce in the future, then naturally the price of that good goes up. And if you're sitting on big inventories of that good, you can basically make windfall profits for a very short period of time
Hmm.
as the value of that inventory goes up. I think the bigger question we need to deal with over the medium term is what is the pricing power of these companies relative to their consumers, and how much of the increase in terms of their input costs are they able to pass on to their consumers? And typically, what you see is the commodity chemical companies have a relatively limited ability
Hmm.
to pass on all the cost increases to their consumers. So that, I think, is the reason why people will probably look through the earnings figures of Q1 and focus much more on Q2, Q3.
Hmm.
Also, as you mentioned, Q1, at least 2 out of 3 months of Q1 are really prior to the crisis starting.
Hmm.
So it's, really the more interesting quarter in many ways will be Q2.
Q2, yeah. And are there also winners amid the supply chain disruptions and price distortions caused by these political conflicts right now?
Well, there are definitely. I mean, one, area of the markets which did extremely well, immediately after the start of the price of the Iran conflict was energy. And if you're an energy producer outside who's producing energy outside of the Middle East, and your production processes have not been challenged at all, but suddenly the price of your final good has gone up by 50% relative to what it was at the end of Q4, obviously that's a windfall gain for you. So there are some pockets of the world where those the energy producers, their production processes really have not been affected by what's happening, but the price of their final good has gone up. So these are the windfall winners. More broadly across the economy, it becomes there. It becomes quite difficult for any sector which is dependent on energy or uses energy in their process to do well. And indeed, arguably, any sector which is a collateral good relative to energy. That sounds a bit complicated, so let me explain what I mean by that. If you are running a restaurant business in the US and energy may be a relatively small part of your cost mix, but on the other hand, your customers are suddenly paying a lot more for gasoline and they really can't reduce their gasoline purchases, well, then they will have less to spend in your restaurant. And so it becomes a kind of the problem of energy is always the same. It becomes quite it has knock-on effects on many sectors, even if just looking at the business itself doesn't seem like the impact should be that big.
Hmm. And Amundi just made an earnings stress test, how much the energy crisis just could get through the earnings. So, do you know what is the overall outcome out of this study?
Well, I think it depends very much on individual sectors, and it's a bit difficult to give you a very broad brush
Hmm.
analysis. I mean, the point of the analysis was much more to look at the individual sectors which are vulnerable to this, to the event, how long the individual sectors have inventory and reserves and stockage processes, either of semi-finished goods or of the raw inputs that they're going to be using in these processes. How much of it is directly energy related? How much of it is uh, the derivatives? Again, we've talked about fertilizer. We could also talk about the sulfates that businesses use to make industrial metals. So if you look across the world as a whole, it becomes very, very difficult to generalize
Mm-hmm.
about and to even say, okay, this is the number for the world as a whole. It's not. I think it doesn't really sort of throw light in the situation. The other thing I would say is that when we think about earnings as a whole, we need to not simply think about what's going on in terms of the Middle East, but we need to think about the other big trend in the world, which is very much the continued investment in and success of artificial intelligence, which
Mm-hmm.
has, again, the capex numbers, which were announced in the Q1 at the end of Q1, are extraordinarily high. This continues to be a huge motor of the US economy, but not just the US economy, because we're seeing an increase in terms of capex in Europe as well, in various different areas. And so, even if we say, well, some businesses are stressed in terms of their costs, businesses which feed in to the capex story may have a greater ability to pass on cost increases than businesses which are dependent on the consumer when consumer demand for for the reality of higher transport costs, higher heating bills is going to be somewhat strained. So I think it's these two sort of balancing forces that we need to look at when we think about earnings,
Mm-hmm.
and we need to look at it very much on a sector by sector basis.
Mm-hmm. So if we go sector by sector, for example, telecommunication,
Yeah.
how are they impacted?
Well, so communication services, so the telecoms sector in general is one of the beneficiaries of artificial intelligence. The reason being because if I'm using a software package, so if I'm using AI sitting at my desk, my I am communicating inherently via a line with a data center sitting somewhere else. So the more AI that we're using, the more revenue there is for the telecoms business. So this is one strong sector where uh, it's not it's not reflected nearly as much in valuations as AI is itself, but communication services definitely is a beneficiary from the trend towards AI. In addition to which, energy is not really a great driver of the cost base of these companies. So it's one of those companies where we can actually look for some positive surprises.
Mhm. So energy is also is the winner in this game?
Energy is I mean, so far, if you're again, it depends where you produce your energy from, right? If you're producing energy principally from the Middle East, it becomes much more difficult. If you're producing energy from outside of the Middle East, then this has been a windfall bonus for you.
Mhm.
So I think that's really the answer.
And what about financials?
Well, so financials are typically an early cyclical sector which benefits very much from the acceleration in capex.
Okay.
So, as a general sort of structural argument, financials benefit a lot from that, and we can see a lot more revenue gains from investment banking business in terms of helping companies raise money, but also a lot more in Europe. We would talk about direct lending opportunities, particularly in the banking sector.
Mhm.
In addition to which, one of the other advantages of the banking sector is that central banks generally have been pretty clear that they are going to let's say err on the side of caution in terms of central bank policy. So we've seen this in Europe, perhaps a little bit less, but certainly in the UK, Australia, New Zealand have been sort of leading the charge here. The Bank of Japan has definitely normalizing interest rates. The Fed is in a somewhat different situation, but in general, we should expect bond yields have risen, and that is also generally helpful for the financial sector as well.
Mhm.
So that's a second big plus.
To look for a sector under pressure, is it the consumer staple and discretionary?
Yes, we have to be careful about it because, as you know, Amazon looms
Yeah,
large in the consumer discretionary sector, even if they're making most of their money from data
it
farms,
is.
right?
Mhm.
So, but outside of that particular company, more broadly, when we talk about the consumer discretionary sector, and more broadly when we talk about the consumer staples sector, our concern is that the ability of consumers to spend will be relatively weak. One, because we think that the increases in energy costs will directly affect consumers. Secondly, because higher interest rates will discourage them a little bit from going out and borrowing. And third, because particularly in the US, the trend towards the distribution of wealth, the imbalance between the distribution of wealth very much
Mhm.
continues. So obviously, you could point to, well, that means that the richer consumer can spend, and indeed they are spending. But generally, with many of these sectors, what you need to have good performance is a broad universe of consumer spending. And in our way of thinking, in the coming quarters, this is going to be challenged. So these are the sectors where we would be most cautious.
And the automotive industry is also under pressure or under disruption?
Well, it's a sector which is changing a lot because it's really one of the sectors where the transition towards use of electricity is continuing and indeed is probably accelerating. So people want to have cars with electric motors when gasoline is becoming more expensive. So that's, I think, an important consideration. I think when we talk about the automotive industry and we get concerned about it, we often are focusing on European automakers. But I think one of the points that we tend to forget is that automakers do two things. They design cars and they run a factory to build cars. And it's quite possible that this running a factory skill can become very, very valuable in the future, particularly in Europe. Why? Because the next wave of artificial intelligence will really be about moving artificial intelligence into the physical world. So
Mhm.
at the moment, artificial intelligence is really about software. It's really about developing software using words. When we're talking about using artificial intelligence to drive industrial drones, for example, you can imagine that the acceleration we need prototypes, we need the models, but then we're also going to need to build a lot of them. And we're gonna
Mhm.
build them using the industries which have an expertise in running
Uh,
factories. And this is where possibly this is an untapped, opportunity and value in terms of, the European some European businesses, the industrial businesses, but also the car manufacturers, because they are excellent at process operations management, at running
ah,
production factories.
but
So it's a bit early for this
to
to happen,
say,
but I would say in the quarters and certainly the years to come, I think this is gonna be much more of a theme for these companies.
did I understand you right? So that you may produce in an automotive factory later on drones or robotics or whatever because they have the
Correct.
processions. Okay.
Exactly,
Okay.
because they know how to do the production processes
Okay,
extremely well.
that's
Yeah.
interesting, yeah. And what about healthcare and biotech? They must also improve very, very rapid.
Well, yes. I mean, there's the sector has been a bit of a disappointment so far,
Yeah.
and as people age, they need more. They need more medicine. They need more healthcare support. It may make companies better at developing drugs and developing these processes. So it looks like the underlying story is still very much there, and artificial intelligence is an opportunity to actually see growth in many areas of healthcare. So we remain optimistic, definitely on the sector in the medium term.
Yeah. And what about the real estate business since they want to put the data centers on the moon? So then
Yes,
maybe. That
Well,
may
sure,
change a lot what
sure.
Paris
I
is.
Yes. I mean, I think the consideration about real estate is it's a very difficult sector to generalize about.
Mm,
If you think about, how, real estate performed during 2020, during the
mm,
COVID years, you had much more people shopping from home, which meant the value of warehouses expanded dramatically, and the value of office buildings fell because you could run an office with fewer people. So the question then becomes, in terms of real estate, what are the sectors which are gonna do well and less well, in the years to come? One of the one of the big opportunities in terms of moving artificial intelligence into the physical world is in building, what we call, in France, BTP, but it's really the whole building process. It's a process of building things. Why do we think this is a big opportunity? Because this is one area where economists have constantly focused on the fact that labor productivity really hasn't changed in the past 50 years. It's more or less as expensive to build a skyscraper today as it was to build a skyscraper in the 1970s.
mm,
So, but you can imagine that if we start talking about, well, if we're able to do construction using drones, using robots, we can manage that labor productivity in construction could increase dramatically. Now,
mhm,
what's the impact in terms of real estate? It's still a little bit up in the air, but what's certainly optimistic is it's very optimistic for the construction business, because we can imagine that there will be an increase in demand. If the actual costs of construction are falling, people will say,
mm.
you know what, we should take this 1970s building, which doesn't have the right specification for what we want, tear it down, and we should build something new because the cost of building something new is much cheaper.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah,
Mm,
so this is definitely, so construction is obviously an area, which can do much better. How this actually impacts the value of real estate as of now is still a little bit up in the air, because you could
mhm,
argue it very profitable opportunities, but you can also argue, the cost of sitting on old things becomes more penalizing.
mhm, okay. And if the square meter is cheaper to produce, then maybe the flats get bigger again or whatever.
Yes,
You never
absolutely.
know.
Yes, yes. It's Jeevan's rule. I mean, it's the question is, if the production processes are getting cheaper, people always want more.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay. And like at last, aviation and tourism, how is
Well,
it
it's a
doing?
very difficult sector. It's a very difficult sector
Mm,
because, first of all, as we started off talking about, the energy costs are
mhm,
a big factor for transport, for getting people to the holiday destination, but also something of an impact for actually taking care of them in terms of the hotel when they're actually in the destination. That's less of an impact in the mix, but it's a factor. And the second thing is, if this is a sector which is turned, of course, towards the consumer. So if again we're entering into a world where the business to business sectors will do better than the business to consumer sectors, then it's a bit of a challenge for the aviation and tourism industry over the medium term.
mhm. And do you think the energy crisis, to come back to it, acting as a catalyst for green technology? You don't see it right now at the stock exchange, but.
Well, no, it's definitely a catalyst for green tech. There's two trends here. One is the electrification of production processes,
Mhm,
which is already was very evident, but it's getting more and more important. And the second factor is, how we choose to produce that electricity. So the important thing about the electrification of production processes is that you have much more choice about how you actually want to produce, energy. And our view is that, this is a further catalyst for, uh, countries and regions and businesses to look for much more energy independence and much more energy flexibility.
mhm,
And green, energy production is part of that, not simply because it's green, but because, if we produce solar energy, in Europe, then we are much more energy independent.
The
Uh,
independence is
yes,
important in the
yeah, the
future.
independence
Mhm.
is tremendously important, and we've seen the countries which have sort of weathered this storm the best in Europe, for example, are the countries which have a lot of domestic energy production, whether it's nuclear, like in the case of France, or whether it's solar power and wind power and renewables in the case of Spain. And all the countries in Europe have been moving this in direction, but the ones which have been moving the fastest are the ones which are probably in the most comfortable position now.
Mhm. Guy, this was really very impressive, and we learned a lot. I say very much thank you, even though there's a day between a leisure day and the weekend, that you took time for us to tell us all your knowledge. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me.
Alles Gesagte ist nur die persönliche Meinung von Julia Kistner und daher keine Anlageempfehlung und keine Rechts- und Steuerberatung. Für Verluste, die aufgrund von getroffenen Aussagen entstehen, übernimmt die Autorin Julia Kistner keine Haftung.